A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
I'm about to speak with finance expert Alex Cook, and pretty soon I'll open up the talkback line, so be thinking about the financial questions you'd like to ask Alex. The number is 1800 316 316, or you can text in on 0447 488 316. This morning, Alex is going to be sharing on the topic, how Christians can reduce their taxes ethically whilst honouring God. I did actually say to him, is there any way I can cheat on my taxes? But he gave me a very stern look. So, of course, Alex won't be giving any specific tax advice. He can't do that. But what he will do is address some biblical issues around tax, as well as some of the practical ways that we really can ethically and legally reduce our tax. Now, Alex is a regular on here, so I don't need to do much intro, but he's a former stockbroker. He's been a successful financial planner. He's the founder of Wealth with Purpose. And his ministry is just simply to help equip Christians to honour God with their finances by teaching sound financial skills. Alex, welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Wendy. It's great to be with you in Neil's absence while he's off having a good time somewhere.
Exactly.
Great to be hanging out with you.
Well, it's nice for me because I get to get some financial advice. Many of us, my husband and I are included, are currently pulling together our paperwork. And this time it's paperwork and it's online stuff. It's all of that in order to complete our financial year tax return. So we sort of do this in two. Yeah, exactly. We do this in two sections. So we break for the news halfway through. But I wanted to spend just the first little bit asking you this question: what is the biblical approach to paying taxes? Let's get that on the table first. What is biblically? What do we have to do about paying our taxes?
Absolutely. Look, there's probably two key scriptures that I draw people's attention to, and because ultimately with money, tax is one of these things that we know we all have to pay, but sometimes I think our motivations can lead us astray. And so it's important because money is such a heart issue at the end of the day, it's important to look at, well, what does the law say? And what is as in what the government says, but also what does the Bible say? And I think the Bible is really crystal clear that taxes are, a normal and ordinary part of our daily lives. But there are things that we can do to legally, ethically reduce our taxation. You don't have to hand it all over, so to speak. But I'll read the two passages that I think speak to it and what I think the principles are, that we can take from it.
That'd be great.
So the first one, the first one that most people are probably familiar with is Romans 13, chapter 13, verses 6 and 7, where it says, "This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honour, then honour." So taxes are an ordinary, part of life, and we are to honour the, if you like, God-ordained authorities that God has put into place over us. And then another one that, once again, people would be very familiar with, possibly even more familiar, from Matthew 22. And I won't read the whole thing out, but the context of this is Jesus is talking with the Pharisees, who we know were great hypocrites at the time, and they were trying to trap Jesus on this particular issue. And, they say to him, or Jesus says to them, "Show me the coin that you're using for paying this tax." And so they brought him a denarius, and then they said, "Whose image is this? Whose inscription?" And they replied, "Caesar's." And of course, then Jesus said to him the famous line, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And I think, therefore, that reflects our sort of dual citizenship, if you like. Anyone listening to this, you're more than likely you're an Aussie citizenship, a resident in Australia, and therefore you're, as a citizen in this country, you're liable to pay tax and give to the ATO what is theirs. And of course, we must honour God as believers, and we must give to God what is God. So we need to live generously and give of what He's given to us. So to me, as I said, I guess the core issue here is that when we pay our taxes, we're submitting to the God-given authority that he's put over us. And, some would also say it's an act of loving our neighbour in the sense that we're supporting, public services such as roads and hospitals and so forth. So there's a real practical benefit too. Even though we don't always agree, obviously, with what governments do with it, which is why I say motives becomes a real issue, because sometimes I think, when we look at the world and the way it's heading, we can get frustrated and our motives may start to take a hold of us, and they might not always be good motives, and we start thinking, but I don't like the way they're doing it, and therefore we think, maybe we should do something that's unusual or not allowed. And so that's why I think as believers we've got to respect who God has put in place, and it doesn't mean we can't challenge things and be part of the political process to change things, but we do need, I think, to honour God and honour the government in the way we handle our taxes. So I think that's the biblical approach to it.
Yeah, wise words. I like it. But it is interesting, isn't it? We've just had a conversation with Stephen McAlpine and talking about how people are unhappy with government at the moment. And, we've seen these marches, polarised different marches.
Over the weekend,
they're all unhappy. Like, March for Australia is unhappy, March for Palestine, they're all unhappy with the government. And, we talk about honouring our taxes because we want to help our neighbour through supporting public services and that sort of thing, that what you've just said, which is exactly right. But then we look at the potholes and we're unable to get important medical assistance and people get a little bit frustrated. But I think as
Absolutely.
Christians, we do need to have a different attitude, don't we? So, you've talked about the biblical,
Correct.
The biblical, I guess, foundation there. So thank you for that. Are there some sort of like overriding principles that a Christian should consider when they're considering this, so that because we're told to give joyfully, give cheerfully, and I know that that's, when we give our tithes and offerings to church, but I think it's also here when we're giving to a government that is working hard to support our roads and our medical stuff. So are there a few overriding principles that you think Christians should consider when we're approaching our giving, even in our taxes?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think one of the key things that should be a mark of a Christian is personal integrity. And I think it's especially important with our personal finances. If we look over the past couple of years, there's been lots of scandals in the church, both locally but particularly obviously in the United States, where there's been a lack of integrity with finances. And I think the real tragedy of that is it brings the church and the body of Christ into disrepute. And, when someone becomes a Christian, you become an ambassador for Christ. And to me, that comes with an enormous responsibility to do things honourably. And whether it's as simple as someone gives you the wrong change and then you have to say, no, actually you've given me too much, and you hand it back, or whether it's bigger things, we need to be people who are, have the highest integrity. And look, there's a good proverb. I love Proverbs, by the way. It's one of my favourite books, I confess. But one of the passages that says, dishonest scales are an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. Now that's one of many passages that point to this idea that as Christians, in all our dealings, particularly financial dealings, we need to be honest people. And I would love if the church was known for that. And I believe in some parts of the world, obviously Australia still has its Christian heritage, but in some parts of the world, Christians are known for that, whereby people realise actually you can trust a Christian more than others because they are trying to live up to that biblical principle. So I think it's a great testimony to the world when we do things honourably. And of course, the reverse is true. The other thing is, the Bible points to the idea that we need to be faithful with little things. Sometimes a lot of Christians have this expectation that God is going to bless them in all sorts of ways because they tithe or they do certain things. It's kind of a cause and effect type theology. But the Bible is clear that, it's hard for us to expect for God to bless us in many ways if we're not faithful with the little things. And to me, a taxation, it's not necessarily a big part of your life in terms of what you think about daily, but it is something that we need to be faithful in. And so that's an important principle. And then, of course, there's the concept of excellence. The Bible calls us to be excellent, and, of course, when we think about this, it can be before in God's eyes, but also in man's eyes.
A biblical perspective on life, culture, and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We ended just before we went to that break, we ended on what the overriding principles are for a Christian that they should consider, particularly when sometimes we're actually unhappy with government as well. And we, Alex, you said integrity, you said faithfulness, you said excellence. Can we pick it up there after excellence? Are there other things that Christians should consider when we're approaching this area that's sometimes a bit annoying, to be honest?
It is, yeah. Look, I think probably the other two would be is just remembering that the principle is that government is a God-ordained authority. It doesn't mean we always agree with them, and obviously these days there's lots of things we don't necessarily, but once again, it's still God's, God has put them there for a reason to make society. The other principle, I think, is diligence. I think sometimes people can be blasé when it comes to finances in general, but also with taxes. And we need to be diligent. We need to do things properly, account for things correctly and not be lazy about it. So diligence, I think, is a critical one. And the other thing is just for those Christians out there where the kind of, the expectation is that God will bless them is because, who doesn't want that, is the idea that, you've got to have integrity with everything you do. God is not going to bless people who lack integrity. And in fact, ultimately, my experience is they get found out. But I meet beautiful Christian people all the time where God just keeps filling up what they have because they have a heart that is right towards God, right towards their motives, and they do the right thing. And I believe God looks after those people. So I say that as an encouragement to people to focus on doing the right thing. It's very important, I think, both in God's eyes, but also obviously in society's eyes as well.
Yeah, so good. Thank you. When we approach our tax, and as I say, Peter and I are doing that right now, none of us really want to pay more tax than we should. Peter and I always want to pay what we should pay. But we try, in trying to minimise our tax or to make sure that we don't pay more than we need to, there's always a risk. And Peter tends to make sure that he errs on the side of being generous and make sure that we don't claim for anything. And I want to claim for every little thing. But in trying to minimise our tax, I guess there's a risk of crossing a line, or there are some grey areas. So what is the difference? I guess it comes down to attitude in a way, but is there a difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion when you're talking about from a Christian ethical standpoint? Are there moral lines there that we really shouldn't cross?
Absolutely. Well, the moral lines, but also legal lines. So under Australian law, and these are very distinct terms in law, is tax avoidance and tax evasion. So tax evasion is illegal. Tax avoidance is not. But the distinction being, when someone's engaged in tax evasion, they're generally engaged in deliberate deception. So, for example, the most common one is probably hiding income. They're earning more than they say they are, and so they're lying about their income and therefore minimising their tax. So that's deception. And of course, that's illegal. Another one is claiming false deductions, and I think this is one's probably more of a risk for Christians in the sense that Christians do want to live generously, and in most cases, what things we give to are tax deductible, but sometimes they're not. For example, giving to your local church. And so Christians just need to be very careful that they're not claiming things that they can't claim, which, by the way, is also a good reason for getting advice and having a tax agent or even a financial planner, but having someone who can guide you and help you to be to do it honourably. But it also raises a point. You were talking about you and your husband. To me, it is good stewardship though to minimise your tax legally. That's actually wise, and that's being a good steward of the resources that God has entrusted into your care. Of course, if you can minimise it in ways that are perfectly legitimate, then that opens up more resources for kingdom work. And so I think that should be our motivation, that, hey, I'm here for a short time and God's blessed me with a certain amount of resources. I want to put those to best use possible to advance his kingdom. And so if that's our way of thinking and motivation, we can engage in sensible, effective tax planning that allows us to maximise those resources. So in that sense, avoiding tax using legal means is perfectly okay. And in fact, the ATO understands that Australians particularly have a right to arrange their affairs in such a way that they can minimise their tax so long as it's lawful. That's the key issue, that you're abiding by the various laws of the land, and when we do that, we're going to talk about some of the practical things people can do in a moment. But there are lots of sensible, good things you can do to legitimately minimise your tax and put that money to better work. And I think in the cases, so that's sensible biblical stewardship.
We do take our tax to a tax consultant, so he's very helpful, and he's actually a believer, so that's really helpful. But even so, it seems to me that there are times when there are grey areas in the tax law where, he would say, look, you can interpret it this way or we can interpret it that way. So how should a Christian, I guess, approach those grey areas where, interpretations might vary? So, but we do want to, we obviously want to have a clear conscience, and we don't want to do the wrong thing, but there are some grey areas. Am I right in that? Or?
Oh, absolutely. And that applies to lots of laws, not just tax law, but sometimes things are grey. But I think there's a sensible approach to this. In fact, Wendy, you kind of touched on it with your husband, Peter, is that I think when in doubt, adopting a conservative interpretation is the most sensible, in the sense I think you can, sleep with a clear conscience and do the right thing.
He's probably listening to this. Yeah.
Yeah. So look, he's obviously a good man. He's a good man. He is. Obviously, the other thing is seeking advice. So you're very wise in doing that. I think seeing a tax agent or an accountant is going to help you minimise the risk of doing the wrong thing. But I think the other thing to really ask yourself, and this is a really useful test, is what you're doing with your taxes, would you be comfortable with that going public? Would you be comfortable with that going into the mainstream media and people finding out about it? I think that to me is a very useful test, because if you're uncomfortable with, what the general public might, and we often joke about, the pub test, if we'd be uncomfortable with that, then maybe, we're pushing things too far. So, but I think always the best thing with all these things is get advice, because you're going to minimise the risk, and you've gone to the principle of being diligent. And I think getting advice, helps you tick that box of being diligent.
We're going to go to the news soon, but before we do, we've just got a little bit of time. I just wanted to thank you again for some of the stuff that I've read that you've said. For instance, I struggle at times. I've been quite politically engaged in my life, and I struggle sometimes with how our taxes are used. For instance, our taxes are used to pay for abortions. That would be one thing, so I really struggle with that. But it is one of the things you say too is, to trust God's sovereignty, but also to channel disagreements through the appropriate civic engagement and voting. So we need to, you also sort of go that way and be involved, get involved with how your taxes are used.
Absolutely. So I think you hit the nail on the head. So rather than as believers us complaining or doing the wrong thing and cheating. The right response is actually getting engaged. And obviously you've done that for years with ACL and so forth. But I think that is the right way to go about it. We don't have to, there's no law that we have to agree with government policy. But what we should be is a voice. Because I think also one of the things that can happen, and this happens around the world, particularly in socialist societies, is that they end up with huge taxes, which then leads to people cheating. So it actually becomes this sort of negative circular thing. But if we can engage in political life to obviously the different extents that we feel God is leading us to, we can help, create policies that are fair. And I mean, I think to me, when I think of political policies, to me, one of the things is, are these policies going to enable human flourishing? And if people are paying excessive taxes, then they're not able to keep some of their money and be incentivized to do good and to start businesses and to flourish.
Thank you.
And so the answer to that is engagement, I think, as you say.
Alex, you've laid out the foundation, the groundwork so clearly. Thank you so much. So I'm going to dive straight in and ask you, are there legitimate tax strategies that align with the Christian principles of honesty, integrity that you've laid out so well, that we can use to reduce our tax? Because we do want to be good stewards of our resources, and there's so many amazing opportunities to give to other missions and to our children even. So can we reduce our tax legitimately? Are there tax strategies?
Absolutely. So that's the good news. There is. Probably an important disclaimer just to say on air is that obviously some of the things that we're going to talk about, people should do their own homework. We'd suggest that people actually talk to proper tax agents and accountants. I'm just a simple financial planner at the end of the day, and financial planners do give lots of what we would call incidental tax advice. But the point being is that we want to share some ideas with people, but they should do their own homework and check things out before they go doing anything that has a tax implication. So that's probably just an important starting point. But the good news is, as I say, there's lots of things and lots of different areas that we could cover off on. I thought probably first we could talk about retirement as one area, and in particular superannuation. Most of us, almost all listeners, probably have a superannuation fund. If you've been an employee in the last 30 years, you've probably got some superannuation. And the superannuation system in Australia is very attractive because of it being a tax structure. So one of the mistakes I like to address is many people think of their super as an investment, when in fact super is really a tax structure. It's a tax vehicle. And one of the big attractions of it is the fact that during your working life, you're in what we call the accumulation phase, and tax at that point is 15%. What a lot of people don't realise is that when you retire and you start a pension with your superannuation fund, it actually becomes tax-free. Becomes completely tax exempt. In fact, one of the things that Peter Costello changed back in, I think it must have been about 2007, is he made it so that the income that you receive from a super fund when you're retired is tax-free if you're over 60 years of age. So superannuation, I often joke with clients, is it's a kind of a bit of a tax haven in a way, because it's low tax during your working life, so say 15%, and it's zero when you retire. So it's enormously attractive in that respect as a way of holding your wealth. And that's why, it's always being played around with by government. The second thing is that there are a number of strategies that people can take advantage of with superannuation that are perfectly normal and legitimate. And probably the most common one people would have heard of is called salary sacrifice, where you give up a portion of your income. Let's make it up. Let's say you earn $100,000. By default, your employer, as of July this year, has to pay 12% of your income into superannuation. So that's a minimum they have to pay. But you can then top it up to $30,000 is the current limit, and you can salary sacrifice that either from your through your pay and arrange for your employer to do that. And what that does is it brings your income tax down from your marginal rate down to 15%. So given that the average Aussie is generally paying 30% or more in income tax, that becomes a really attractive potential strategy. Another way of doing it, which is essentially the same thing, is you can make contributions into super and claim them as a tax deduction up to $30,000. Now, that includes, obviously, what your employers put in. There are some other small ones that I'd encourage listeners to have a look at. So things like, for example, spouse contributions. There's another great one where the government will actually match your contributions. So if you put in $1,000, they'll match it up to $500. That's what we call the government co-contribution. So that's something that people can Google. But the important thing here is to say is that superannuation is a vehicle, obviously set up for retirement, but it's a great way of a structure to park your wealth in what we call a low tax environment. And as I say, it's perfectly legitimate, perfectly normal, and something that people can use to comfortably prepare for their retirement, which is something, even though I said, and other listeners who've heard me for over the years, I'm not a huge believer in retirement. I kind of believe you run your race for Jesus right to the end. But the practical reality is that most of us will retire at some point from paid employment, and we do need to prepare financially for that. And so, as I say, to minimise your tax legally and legitimately, we have this wonderful superannuation system. So that's one area.
I'm just sorry I cut across you then, but as a young person, when I was paying money into superannuation for my first job, it just seemed like such a long way away, Alex. Like it seemed like, but can I say it comes around very quickly? So my husband and I are now.
It does.
We're sort of semi-retired now. We downsized our home. We were able to put money into our super from that. We were able to, and none of this, we would not have known how to do it if we didn't get advice. So I really do want to say to people getting advice, because we wouldn't have known about downsizing. We were even able to minimise the tax that our children will need to pay if they end up receiving money from our superannuation as an inheritance. So the advice that we were given helped us to do that even. So
fantastic.
Yeah, I really do want to say that. We do have a text message that's come in. It's good morning, Alex and Wendy. My 21-year-old daughter earned over $4,000 in interest from savings in a bank account and ended up with a tax bill this year. She's earning a $70,000 salary, single, lives at home and is saving well. What should she do? Now, I know you can't give specific advice, but you might be able to give some general advice. What should she do? Build a house, pay extra into a super fund, or something else to both keep her tax down and make wise financial decisions for her future? So, paid tax because she earned interest.
Well, I always say to people, if you're paying tax, that's a good thing in the sense that you're making money, right? So that's not. So paying tax is not necessarily a bad thing in that sense. The way I sort of tend to answer these questions is by looking at it in the context of someone's age. So this particular scenario, we're talking about a 21-year-old, and as you alluded to earlier, life goes very quickly, and you wake up one day and you go, "Oh, how did I get to retirement?" And I say that as someone who turns 50 next year, and I think, wow, where did that all go? But for a 21-year-old, the key thinking, I think, is to say, what are my goals over the next few years? So more than likely, a 21-year-old is probably saving for their first home, and so superannuation in that sense is probably a lower priority. So yes, you could put money in and get deductions and so forth. No doubt. But there might be other greater priorities, such as starting to learn to invest, which I think is a good lesson to learn at a young age. But also, I think things like, saving for your first home, and that will be a far greater priority at that age. Now, that doesn't mean young people can't do things tax effectively. So someone who's, say, a 21-year-old who's earning $70,000, one of the things that young people tend to ignore is insurance. And so a 21-year-old may have, 40 years of working life ahead of them. And one of the things, because once again, we're talking about tax deductions here and tax benefits, a 21-year-old, for example, should take out income protection, which is a tax-deductible expense. So premiums on income protection policies are tax-deductible. So that's something that a young person should absolutely have in place, because if they got unwell, or particularly seriously unwell, they might have 40 years of lost working life if they became, particularly unwell or disabled. And so having that kind of thing is important. And also, particularly once they get married, and it's structuring their funds to do what we call income splitting. So if let's say a situation where there's husband and wife, one may be raising children while the other's working, having money in the low income or no income spouse's name could be a good thing to do as well. So there's lots of little things we can do that reduce our tax liability quite legitimately. And as I say, your age and stage of life will certainly impact that. Yeah. Because obviously there's just different priorities at different stages of life.
Yes.
So, but that's a great question.
Yeah, it is a really good question. And particularly, a mum who's obviously got a very responsible daughter trying to help her. I totally understand that. There's another question that I might actually be able to answer. It's about whether if you donate to youth care, there's a tax deduction. Now, I've just while I've just been sitting here looking at that, I've looked up on their website, and it does still say you can make a tax deductible donation to youth care chaplains, but you would need to go through their website and just sometimes I think, am I right in this, Alex, that there are some organisations that have one bucket of money that is tax deductible and one bucket of money that isn't. And so you've just got to be careful that if you wanted that tax deductibility, you've got to make sure you go through the right bucket.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's often the case even with churches. Giving to a local church in and of itself, for example, isn't. But sometimes they set up specific funds for property for future, maybe they're starting a Bible college or they're trying to do certain things, and then they set up a separate fund specifically that is deductible. The main thing here, I think, is just to be diligent, and before you make a claim, that you check it out before you obviously go claiming something, so you are doing it legitimately. But the only other comment I'd make about that is just be careful not to give in order just to get tax deductions, because our motivation as believer is to the kingdom purpose that sits behind it, whether it's supporting a charity or a church or a mission or a political lobby group or any of those sort of things. We should be giving because we feel God has put on our heart to give to that thing, as opposed to the tax benefit that may or may not come from it. So
that's
just
so
important.
Good. I love that.
Just comment to make, yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about superannuation. What about other ways? Like, are there any income splitting, for instance, that sort of thing?
Yeah, look, absolutely. So, look, a couple of things here. So income splitting is generally where you've got husband and wife, and one is a low-income earner and the other's a high-income earner. It's generally wise to put any investment assets or any cash in the name of the low-income earner. So that way, when income is generated from those investments, you're using up, for example, the tax-free threshold on that low-income earner or no-income earner before it gets applied to the high tax earner. So that's what we would call just simple structuring of your affairs, and that sort of thing is perfectly okay and not an unusual thing to do. Also, many listeners might be engaged in property investment, for example, or shares investment. And one of the laws of deductibility in Australia is if you borrow money in order to invest, whether it's in shares or in real estate, the law is that you can claim a deduction on things like the interest and expenses associated with that investment, to the extent that the reason for your investment is to gain assessable income. So that's sort of the law of deductibility, that if you're entering into a transaction trying to generate, assessable income, such as property rent or dividends from shares, then the expenses associated with that become deductible. Now, once again, I encourage listeners to get proper tax advice before doing anything in this area. But there's all sorts of things here, particularly, with property investment, whether it's depreciation, investment loans, and all the costs associated that you can potentially claim. And likewise, with investing, there's all sorts of things that you can do, whether it's understanding, for example, Australia has a fabulous system around dividends where you can get franking credits, where essentially if you buy, a lot of local Australian shares, you'll actually get a franking credit that goes into your tax return. And depending on your tax rate, you might actually get a cash refund from the ATO for those franking credits. So that's something to learn about. Obviously, we can't really unpack it in huge detail now, but that's something people could look at. But the other thing also is the timing of your investment decisions. So let's say, for example, you've bought some shares. Those shares have gone up in value. If you sell those shares before 30th of June in the current financial year, you'll pay tax on them in the financial year. If you delay the sale until, after July, then you're deferring it into a future year. And so there's simple things like that where the timing of your decisions may impact your tax liability. You may know, for example, you're going to retire, so you don't sell your investment property until after you've retired, where you've got a lower income. So there's things like that where you're structuring your affairs in such a way that you can, minimise your tax liability in ways that are perfectly normal, nothing unusual, and so forth. But as I say, the key thing here is getting advice before you do anything to make sure you're not only, I think, obeying the law in and of itself, but also the spirit of the law as well. So I think that's critical.
Yeah. My husband and I looked at, the cost of getting advice, and we were like, oh boy, and then we were like, no, we're going to save a lot more by getting the advice. And, even when you're talking about franking credit and that sort of thing, the average person just doesn't really know what you're talking about.
No.
But you go to somebody like you, and there are people you can really trust. We've just found it so incredibly helpful. So I do really advise people to do that personally myself, as somebody who really doesn't know money at all. But, we've been talking about individuals and mums and dads and people like my husband and I. What about business owners? That's another kettle of fish. There will be business owners out there who have the radio on going in their business, that they often people choose to have vision on during their business hours, which we absolutely love. So there's business owners. What considerations should they be making? Is there any advice you can give them?
Absolutely. And look, in many cases, business owners have a lot more options in one sense to the way they structure their affairs. Some of it's obviously the obvious legitimate things where they can claim, business expenses and get deductions on those, and that reduces their tax on their business revenue. So that's one, I guess, really obvious one. The only one that I would warn people of, and this is because I've seen this over the year of 25 years of giving advice. Some small business owners do tricky things, like they try and run personal expenses through their business, and no-nos like that. So once again, coming back to our the beginning where we talked about it, is we want Christians to be people of integrity, and so we need to make sure we separate very distinctly what's a legitimate business expense from what's a personal expense. So that's an important comment to make. But certainly there's no problem with business owners structuring their affairs to minimise tax. So a common one, for example, with many business owners is they may have a company. That company is owned by a trust. The revenue, or if you like, the dividends from the business go into the trust and then can be distributed to different family members and so forth based on their tax rates. So that's a very common thing. Once again, it may sound a bit complicated talking about it on air, but a proper tax agent and accountant can give you good advice around that as well. The other one for businesses, particularly when they think about retirement, there are a lot of what we call small business tax concessions, where they can sell their business, for example, and put large amounts into superannuation, and also there's a whole range of complicated tax laws, which really, as I say, require professional advice. But small businesses, particularly when they go to sell and retire, have a lot of options potentially available to them. But the comment, once again, for business owners is just make sure you're being a good witness to your staff, doing things properly, your customers, and, of course, your local community as well. But, yeah, get advice is a critical thing for all small business owners.
So that's fabulous. When at the moment in Australia, there are people who are really facing some tough times. Obviously, we've got a housing crisis. Our groceries are going up, everything. So there are people who are genuinely really struggling. Can you just give us some biblical principles about how we cover our tax bill, but we've also got other financial obligations. Obviously we're caring for our family, but then there's also our obligations to our churches. We pay, we give, or some people call it a tithe. But are there biblical principles that you can give us about what our priorities, I guess, and where our money goes?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, obviously, and I do want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people doing it tough in Australia at the moment. Since COVID, rents have exploded, up about 50%. And of course, Australia, and listeners may have heard me quote this before, is that Australia is the second most indebted households on earth. And of course, a lot of that's gone into housing. So there are a lot of people who do feel that genuine pinch, especially I think people who are probably under 50 years of age that haven't got into the housing market as early as the older generations have, and therefore are most affected by it. But even with that, I think it's important to remember that government obligations are legitimate debts. We do have to honour them. We can't just say, oh, well, times are tough, I'll just avoid doing it. No, we still have to honour those obligations because they are legitimate, and as I say, we don't necessarily like them, but they're there for a reason. But also, I've found if you deal with the ATO and organisations like that upfront and honestly, they're far more likely to help you. So, for example, if you're struggling to pay a tax bill, you can call them and arrange for a payment plan so it gets spread out over time rather than, you having to come up with it in all one big hit, which, may cause a stress and may have a huge impact on your family. But if you can negotiate with them, and indeed there are actual accountants out there that help negotiate tax debts to be reduced, all sorts of things, if you're diligent, that you can discover and do properly. So, as I say, payment plans are one. There are accountants out there that can help deal with the ATO directly and negotiate on your behalf and things like that. But also, you mentioned things like tithing and so forth. And to me, as Christians, even in tough times, we should continue to give faithfully and sacrificially. That may not be a particular percentage, and I know there are different theological positions out there on this topic, but certainly I think we always want to maintain our giving and balance that out. Obviously, we pay our taxes legitimately because we have to, but also, even in tough times, still maintain our giving as much as we can. There may be times where, you have to reduce it a little bit because of just the economic reality that we find ourselves in. But to me, we should never stop giving altogether. We want to continue to do that faithfully. But also on that is just seeking wise counsel from people around you, whether it's, church leaders or actual financial professionals, but people who can help you navigate through tough times. I always say to people, life is full of, ups and downs, and it can be messy and chaotic. You don't want to walk life alone. You want to get help and talk to people, and you'll find many people have had those experiences themselves. So,
Alex, we're going to have to draw it to a close, which is a shame because I do have another question here, but we're not going to get time to go to it. But I've just screenshot it because I'm going to actually send it to you just in case this. But it was. Thanks for a great conversation. I wanted to ask regards to business finances, what is the best practical way to set up our finances from day one? Because it's a small startup, consumer-focused, product-based business that's just about to start. So we're not going to have time to get to it. But can I say to this person who texted in, but also to everybody listening, you can get help from Alex's website. So there's a website, wealthwithpurpose.com. So it's www.wealthwithpurpose.com. On that website, there are free ebooks, there is a toolkit, there are some free videos, there's podcast content. Alex is also on Facebook, he's on Twitter. You can email him as well, and that is askalex@wealthwithpurpose.com. You get paid for your work, and you come on here free of charge to give us some advice. You're happy for us to go on your website. This is kingdom building, Alex, and we're so grateful to you because people like my husband and I need people like you. And so thank you so much for your time today. We're really grateful.
Thanks, Wendy. No, look, it's a pleasure to be with you. And people, as they can check out our website, and we can also point them in the right direction and also connect them up with Christians who can give advice around this particular area that we've been talking about today as well. So
yeah, that's perfect.
Happy to do that.
It's perfect because often financial advisor won't understand when you say, look, I give 10% of my money away. They go, what? I can't help you. Go away. Yeah. A Christian understands that. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.